Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the public outwards-facing session of our Beneficial Ownership Transparency Forum. We have a terrific panel for you this afternoon. Greetings to the many people online, and thank you for your patience as we address some of the technical challenges of getting our Zoom link up and running. So we can see you there, and there'll be plenty of opportunities for you to participate and engage. I want to just simply start by thanking our hosts, BHP, for their fantastic hospitality and facilitation for this event, but more importantly, being such good champions of this agenda and moving many of us, including colleagues in the room and in industry, around this shared priority of deepening commitment to beneficial ownership transparency in the private sector in particular. But this afternoon's session ranges more broadly than that. This is a conversation between both people in person and others virtually from different countries of the world. So you're going to hear a range of perspective from leaders in companies, an MP from the UK Parliament who's very much a champion of this work, and from civil society. So it's a range of leading thinkers and practitioners in this space to present their ideas and thinking to move this agenda along. I'm not going to say much more because you're going to hear a lot from our speakers, but I'll summarize at the end. The speakers are going to try and convey a huge amount of information, mostly in 5 minutes apiece. John, you have more time, as our key speaker here. But there will be time for questions at the end, and we will take media questions first, where we see those online, and then open out for the wider audience. And note that we will have a roving mic moving around the room for those of you who'd like to contribute. Now then, we're going to start with a pre-recorded message from Helen Clark, the EITI board chair and former Prime Minister of New Zealand and head of UNDP, who is passionate about this agenda, as you will now hear.
Greetings, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this important forum, jointly organised by BHP, the EITI, Open Ownership, and the B Team. I've been a lifelong advocate of transparency and accountability. As board chair of the EITI, I'm pleased to be able to help advance transparency and accountability as critical attributes for the extractive sector. In many resource-rich developing countries, the revenues derived from oil, gas, and/or minerals can make such a significant contribution to economic growth and development. Indeed, if managed well, the extractive sector can make the difference between prosperity and poverty for millions of people. But the extractive sector is also one which is vulnerable to corruption. So the EITI and its partners have a vital role to play in improving the governance of the sector around our world. The vast majority of corruption scandals have used shell companies and opaque ownership structures as vehicles in which to hide illegal activities such as money laundering and tax evasion. According to Global Financial Integrity, developing countries are losing an estimated $1 trillion in revenue every year from corrupt deals, which are often facilitated by anonymous companies. So opening these shadowy structures up to public scrutiny is a vital step in the fight against corruption in the extractive sector. Natural resources should be benefiting all of a country's citizens and not just lining the pockets of a few. Beneficial ownership transparency enables citizens, journalists, anti-corruption bodies and prosecutors to follow the money and to hold the companies and individuals who profit from the sector to account. It also supports companies to conduct business responsibly and supports governments to monitor conflicts of interest. I think today's event on beneficial ownership transparency is significant for three key reasons. First, It is taking place on the eve of the G7 Interior Ministers meeting, which is charged with taking forward commitments around transparency made by leaders at the G7 summit in June. Proposals by both the G7 and the G20 to target illicit financial flows and anonymous company structures recognise the urgency of this topic and the need for action. Reforms can no longer be put on the back burner. We need action now to tackle corruption decisively and ensure that public revenues from extractives are wisely used. Second, a leading group of extractive companies has committed today to a common set of policies and practices on beneficial ownership transparency. This development is part of growing momentum for beneficial ownership transparency, and I commend the companies taking this step. Can I also acknowledge with appreciation the contribution of BHP in hosting this meeting and thereby ensuring that a broad group of stakeholders can come together to discuss reform. Third, today also marks the official launch of Opening Extractives, a 5-year program funded by the BHP Foundation and jointly implemented by the EITI and Open Ownership. This program will accelerate the implementation of beneficial ownership transparency in 12 countries. These include Argentina, Ghana, Indonesia, Liberia, Mexico, Mongolia, Nigeria, Philippines, and Zambia. Making beneficial ownership transparency a reality is complex and requires a high degree of political commitment, technical expertise, and collaboration. In 2016, the EITI standard introduced requirements on disclosing the real owners of extractives companies. Since then, many countries have made great strides on advancing that agenda. And through platforms such as the Open Government Partnership and the EITI, more than 110 countries have now committed to beneficial ownership disclosure in some form. We look forward to building on that work through the Opening Extractives program. The economic setbacks caused by the global pandemic have affected the budgets of every country. That makes it all the more important that revenues from the extractive sector, which should be flowing to public coffers, actually do flow there and not somewhere else. We could go so far as to say that beneficial ownership transparency can contribute to a just recovery. It's one of the best weapons we have to fight illicit financial flows and corruption. If we succeed, the prize is large. It means countless billions of dollars not going into the pockets of corrupt officials and business people, but rather going into the economic and social investments that will drive sustainable development. We all have a role to play in the battle against corruption. Together, we can ensure that beneficial ownership transparency becomes the norm in the extractive sector and beyond. Thank you.
Well, I think that helps to ground our conversation today very well. So I'm joined here in the room in BHP by Tom Townsend, Executive Director of the Open Ownership, and of course our partner in the Opening Extractives program. So Tom is on hand to answer those really tough questions from the audience. And by Joe Jones, EITI's Communication Director, who will be supporting me in ensuring we have good online engagement. But I really want to extend a warm introduction to John Penrose, who's been right at the leadership of the beneficial ownership transparency work, not just here in the UK, but also serving as a champion to stimulate and encourage efforts worldwide. So officially serves as the Prime Minister's anti-corruption champion. But I know from my own exposure to to you in the past, in previous fora, back 2 years ago to the Open Government Partnership Summit in Ottawa, Canada. The very early days of some of these conversations, and I think we both remarked how much progress we have made, and it's especially exciting to see that progress now being driven by so many companies. John, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. And I also remember those early days back in Ottawa and since then, and it has been brilliant to see the progress that's been made right up till today. I hope and expect there will be more, but it is absolutely superb to see EITI and this list of companies. This is the royalty of mining, this list of companies here, ladies and gentlemen, joining up to the open ownership, beneficial ownership transparency banner. And so it's extremely welcome news. It isn't, of course, only extractives. Extractives were early to the party. Kudos to EITI and the companies involved for being so far-sighted. But it isn't, of course, just the extractive sector. It goes far wider than that. The UK plays host to one of the two biggest financial services sector centres on the planet. Finance matters too. All the professional services firms that surround it matter too. That's the accountants and the lawyers who make all these things happen either in good fashion or in bad. But Mark is absolutely right that if you start with extractives, and extractives as a key piece, an extremely large and important economic piece of the world's trade jigsaw, if you start there, then my goodness me, you are off to a brilliant, brilliant beginning. And it isn't also just a question of doing it industry by industry. It's a question of doing it country by country, as we heard from Helen just now. And so I'm really pleased to say that it isn't just the UK, and incidentally the UK's overseas territories as well, but it's a whole and a growing list of other countries in the last couple of years have signed up to these principles for not just extractive industries, but for their entire economy too. And the point about that, ladies and gentlemen, and I appreciate that I am preaching to the choir here. Everybody here knows this, but it is worthwhile putting it on the record anyway. The point about that is that for every new industry and for every new country that we add to this ever-growing, steadily growing list, we create network effects. Because if you are a banker or any company with a supply chain trying to do your due diligence, it becomes that much easier to do the due diligence for the people you are trading with, the people you are lending to, the people you are taking on as clients, if you can find out who really owns them, because you can just go and check another country's beneficial ownership register. And so those network effects expand and multiply every time we add a new name to the list. The other thing that's worthwhile mentioning is that there's a huge, huge economic and political prize for doing this. For any country that is nervous, worried, or concerned about doing this, there's a really powerful argument which we can all make, which is simply, look, beneficial ownership transparency doesn't cost your treasury a single dime in taxpayers' money. I mean, it may cost a little bit in IT to get the thing set up. But in terms of all those other anti-poverty and anti-corruption and programs you can launch, this is one of the cheapest, the best value programs you can possibly think of. So why aren't you doing it already? And in general, particularly if you're talking to a flinty-hearted person from whichever country's treasury or finance ministry, you find that they are powerfully persuaded by this kind of argument. So we have the strongest possible arguments, not just morally, but also economically, on our side. And that means that I think that explains a great deal about why organisations like EITI, but others as well, are making such great progress in those couple of years since, Mark, you and I first started talking about this in Ottawa and before. And it means that you can see that the bus is leaving the station. America has already said, under President Biden, it wants to start moving faster in this direction. The Canadians have said they want to start moving faster in this direction. There's a huge long list of other countries, as I just mentioned, that have already signed up or are considering signing up. I understand there are other members of the EITI roster who are not yet signed up in today's announcement, but I devoutly hope that many of them will add their names in future for exactly this reason, because the bus is leaving the station. You might as well be on it. It makes so much sense. And it is much better for a company's brand. It is much better for a country's reputation if everybody knows that you are a haven for clean money rather than dirty money, whether or not you intended to be, but you may or may not be, because there's a far greater amount of clean money in the world than there is dirty money anyway. So you can do well by doing good, ladies and gentlemen. It makes sense for your bottom line, it makes sense for your reputation, it makes sense for your company's and country's treasury function. Why on earth wouldn't you join in? Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to BHP for sponsoring us today.
And you can still sense that strong enthusiasm for this agenda unalloyed after several years. It's great that you were able to join us. We're now going to turn to the other part of the world, Australia, where BHP has major operations, where we're joined by Tim Robinson, who's the Chief Compliance Officer for BHP Worldwide. And hopefully Tim will be joining us online now.
Hopefully you can hear me, Mark, and everyone there.
I can hear you and see you very well. Thanks, Tim.
Great. Thanks very much. Well, I'd like to start by thanking you, Mark, and EITI, the B team and Open Ownership for all of their work with us over many, many months setting up this forum, which hasn't been straightforward during COVID. And I'd also like to apologise and express my very deep regret for not being able to be there with you today in our London office. It's very frustrating to be stuck here in Australia. As many of you know, BHP is a leading global resources company. Our strategy is to create value, including by growing our exposure to a portfolio of world-class expandable assets in what we are calling future-facing commodities, the commodities that the world needs for economic growth and decarbonisation. Our corporate purpose is to bring people and resources together to build a better world. And as Chief Compliance Officer, I have the great privilege of overseeing our anti-corruption program and its contribution to achieving that purpose by operating ethically and by contributing to the global fight against corruption. My own professional background is as an anti-corruption lawyer, and that's a calling which has allowed me to work with many incredible people in many fascinating countries over the last couple of decades of my career. And I know many of you here today have also been part of the long-running fight against corruption over many years. And I suspect many of you also share some level of disappointment or even frustration at the level of corruption that remains in many parts of the world today. I'm very hopeful that our discussion here today and the commitments that we're making can hopefully contribute to some much needed progress. Our industry can make a transformational contribution to host countries and communities, but the true scale of that contribution can only be realised when companies operate ethically, when they negotiate fairly with host governments and communities, when they pay their fair share of tax, and most importantly, when the terms on which we develop resources are transparent and free from corruption. And fighting corruption in our industry has never been more important. Increasing commitments to action on climate change will accelerate the electrification of transport and the decarbonisation of power, and are bringing increased focus to future-facing commodities like copper, nickel and potash. In the Paris-aligned 1.5 degree scenario that we outline in our climate change report, we expect demand for primary copper almost doubling and a demand for primary nickel almost quadrupling over the next 30 years compared to the past 30 years. But many significant undeveloped assets in these commodities are located in developing countries where corruption remains a well-recognised challenge. For development of those resources to truly build a better world for those host communities, corruption must be tackled, and now is the time to tackle it. The publication of information about who owns or benefits from the right to develop natural resources will operate as a major disincentive to corruption. It also has the potential to open the process to greater public scrutiny and ultimately increase public trust and confidence in the process that host governments run to grant mineral and petroleum rights. These are all reasons why we have supported public beneficial ownership registers for many years, and why we're proud to support the statement of companies today. But in addition to those obvious benefits for sustainable development, there are also some key benefits for companies in supporting beneficial ownership transparency. First and foremost, public registers have a great potential to reduce opportunities for corruption in the process for granting mineral and petroleum rights, by making it much more difficult for corrupt actors to conceal conflicts of interest or corrupt benefits in ownership structures. a mechanism that's been seen in many major corruption scandals in the industry. Preventing this mechanism of corruption should provide real benefits to companies who are committed to operating ethically and never engaging in corruption by preventing those corrupt companies from gaining an unfair and ultimately illegal advantage in the competition for access to resources. Transparency should instead promote a level playing field, fair and legitimate competition for access to those resources based on the value that each company can offer host countries in return for developing those resources. Second, today's commitments and requirements for ultimate beneficial ownership transparency should send an important advance signal that corruption will not be tolerated in the industry and will be exposed. This signal should resonate through all parts of the value chain and through companies of all sizes, ranging from the initial grant of exploration tenements to small exploration companies, through other parts of the supply chain and through all subsequent permitting and licensing processes. It should help us as an industry avoid the problem of tainted assets, that is, valuable discovered resources that can confront major hurdles to development when due diligence at a later stage identifies corruption in the granting of earlier licenses or approvals. And third, public beneficial ownership data makes it easier, less expensive and more reliable for companies to complete due diligence on our suppliers and our partners. That helps us satisfy ourselves that we know who we're dealing with and obviously meets the expectations of anti-corruption regulators globally. At BHP, we've got over 9,000 suppliers. We devote significant resources to obtaining and assessing this information. But for many smaller companies in the industry, that may not be practical due to the cost and complexity of that exercise. But public data should reduce that cost. It should improve the industry's ability to conduct due diligence and improve the ability of even small players in the industry to conduct appropriate due diligence, further strengthening the anti-corruption agenda. Personally, I'm a firm believer in the role of the private sector in fighting corruption. And I'll end today by thanking our peers who've signed today's statement and encouraging those in the industry who've not yet signed up to do so. It has been fantastic throughout today to see so much support for the initiative from all the participants in the discussions. We very much look forward to continuing our support in the future and most importantly to translating the commitments that we're making today into a real and tangible reduction of corruption where it matters the most in coming years. Thanks very much.
Many thanks. Tim, we heard you loud and clear and thank you for joining us at this late hour. Our next speaker is Don Fancher, who's the co-leader of Deloitte's Legal Business Services and principal of Deloitte Financial Advisory Services. Don, I believe you're online. If you'd like to unmute yourself and join us now, please.
Yes. Hey there, Mark. Can you hear me and see me okay?
Very well, thank you.
All right. I think there was a speaker Zoom and I didn't get that link. So hopefully this will work just fine. And it is wonderful to be with everyone today. My apologies, I'm not there in person. That was my hope to be there in person, but circumstances got in the way of that. So appreciate being able to participate in this way. I wanted to talk just for a couple of moments about the role that the accounting and the professional services firms can take as we look at beneficial ownership and beneficial ownership transparency. I thought I'd start by giving some things that are probably pretty obvious, but set the stage a little bit for the role that the Big Six, that other professional services firms can play. And it's really through the relationship that we have with our clients, with the community as a whole, and with governments in so many different ways. Obviously, we are integral to financial reporting and the clarity around financial reporting through our audit and assurance services that we provide to public companies, to private organizations. We obviously provide significant tax services. And perhaps the largest part of our business is on the consultative side, where we're working on system implementation, working with our clients on strategy, looking at artificial intelligence and technology solutions, but also looking at compliance capabilities, investigating fraud, and in financial crime. These are areas where I personally lead Deloitte's practice in fraud, financial crime, and related activities. So I've personally seen the impact that corruption has on organizations and on communities, governments, and regions as a whole. So there's a myriad of solutions we provide to our corporate clients, but we also do the same for our government clients, our public sector clients. So we really are in a pretty unique position because we touch every aspect of these organizations, the boards and the C-suites, employees, individuals throughout the enterprise, And as Tim just mentioned, it's not just the specific enterprise, it really is that extended enterprise where you're looking at partners, supply chains, regulators, and governmental entities as well. So as we're connected to each of these, we have a commitment as the professional services firms to really focus on the issues of transparency and beneficial ownership. We've played a vital role in this for many, many years, and we will continue to do that, working alongside our clients, governmental agencies, and the global community as a whole to continually advance this issue as an integral part of continuing to reduce corruption, but more importantly, to enhance trust. And I think there's really three ways that we in the professional services firms can do that. So I'd like to talk about that now. The first is on that issue of trust, really advancing trust and understanding that that is a key component for organizations, and beneficial ownership is a key part of that issue of trust. Trust is really the new corporate currency, and every organization needs to recognize this. We at Deloitte have done an extensive amount of research. That's actually one of the things I lead within Deloitte, is what we call our future of trust. And I know my colleagues in the other big six, PwC certainly, and others, have been very active in speaking about the importance of trust. The reason is because trust is an asset, and trust equity really brings value to organizations in an incredible way. It drives performance. Let me give you a few statistics from some of the research that we and that others have done. The reason I think this is so important is because this is a big part of the role that we in the professional services firm can play to help our clients as well as government entities to see the importance of beneficial ownership. Trustworthy companies outperform their competitors by 2.5 times. High trust companies outperform their sector by an average of greater than 5%. And 62% of customers who highly trust a brand will buy almost exclusively from that brand. And it's worse for employees as well. In fact, 79% of employees who highly trust their organization are more motivated to work and provide greater value to their employer. Equally as important are negative trust events. A negative trust event can damage the reputation and decrease the value of a company by over 30% compared to its peers. And market cap reduction can be anywhere from 20 to 56%. That's a huge impact from negative types of events. So Deloitte, our big six colleagues, we will continue to, I believe, promote the importance of trust, use that as a proactive solution to come alongside our clients and help them to see the value of enhancing trust and beneficial ownership as a component of this. There's another area that really is what we've been doing for a long time, and I think we will continue to need to do, and that's more of a reactive perspective, but using that reactive effort to be proactive as well. Obviously, partnering with global corporations such as WEF, the OECD, EITI, the B team as we are here today, that's going to be really important for us to use our role and our voice with those organizations to talk about the importance of anti-corruption. We will also continue to address issues like corruption, financial crime, and fraud that is so often the result of shell companies and a lack of transparency and ownership. We can do this through enhanced compliance, continuous monitoring solutions, being more proactive in fraud detection, using technology, and then using the remediation activities that we have and the investigations that we perform to better understand these patterns and the way that financial crime occurs. Financial crime is always changing. Bad actors are always changing the way that they do this. And we have an opportunity to take the learnings and make that more of a proactive solution as well. The final thing I'll say is technology. I know, Mark, I see you looking at get me finished up here. Let me talk about technology just really, really quickly. I think it's really important for us in the professional services firms and with our corporate clients, as well as our government clients, to understand the importance of technology. And for technology to truly be used effectively, we have to have data. We need data sharing, we need larger data sets, and then we need to be able to use that data and the artificial intelligence, machine learning that we have to find those patterns that create fraud, financial crime, and give greater indications to where these transparency issues are really a challenge. And as we see new technologies coming into place, take blockchain, for example, it's a great opportunity for us to promote security through blockchain, but it's an equally great opportunity for bad actors to use it if we don't have that transparency. So these are all areas, I think, Mark, where we in the professional services can and should and will continue to promote beneficial ownership and help our clients and our governmental clients as well, to continually enhance these areas. So thanks for the time and for allowing me to be here.
Thank you very much, Don, and it's great to know that moderation exercise virtually can also be picked up. So thank you so much. And I also just like to echo what Don said from some of the contributions we heard from other professional services companies this morning in our closed event, notably from KPMG and BDO. So we're really excited to hear how that work will future develop. We're now going to have a change of tone and scene by sharing a short video with you, which I think is ready to be played now.
Natural resources belong to a country's citizens, but too often communities are not seeing the benefits. When the identities of those who benefit from oil, gas and mining are hidden, wealth from these activities can be diverted by corruption and mismanagement. This means less public funding for priorities such as healthcare and education, stifling opportunity and development. Knowing the true owners of extractive companies is key to solving this problem and ensuring citizens benefit from their country's natural resources. That's why EITI and open ownership are unlocking the benefits of ownership transparency.
The lack of transparency about company owners in the extractive sector in Nigeria has been very problematic. That's why you have issues around illicit financial flows.
Opening extractives aims to make it much harder for anonymous companies to be used to mismanage the extractive sector. Closing this channel for corruption can contribute to development and help ensure that citizens benefit from their country's natural resources.
The Philippines is a resource-rich country, and much is to be gained in ensuring good governance, accountability, and transparency in the management of our resources. Identifying the real owners of companies help prevent money laundering and other illicit financial activities.
Opening extractives will support over 10 countries. It will help governments make reforms which will disclose the identities of those who own and control extractive companies. The programme will work with stakeholders to support them to use beneficial ownership data. Citizens, governments and companies will use this data to improve how natural resources are governed. What we find will be shared worldwide to advance beneficial ownership transparency in natural resources and beyond.
I want to look at what revenues they are getting, what taxes they are paying. I want to look at the laws governing the sector and how they have been complying with that.
If we can find who is the ownership, we can make better cases to the judges. Working in these elements to fight political corruption in a very important sector of my country, that is the energy companies.
Beneficial ownership register being publicly available to the people would help to reduce conflicts, would help to increase revenue that government is going to take.
The country's natural resources ultimately belong to the people, and it is the right of every citizen to be informed of who actually benefits in the extraction and utilization of these resources. We are optimistic that the program could help us maximize beneficial ownership information in improving revenue and natural resource management.
We are at a tipping point, and now is the time to act. As countries around the world face the challenge of climate change and the economic impact of COVID-19, sustainable governance of natural resources is essential. A solution can only be achieved if governments, industry, civil society and communities work together. By unlocking the benefits of ownership data, opening extractives ultimately aims to improve the lives of millions of people in resource-rich countries.
Well, I think that video conveys our enterprise very well and very convincingly, so I hope you found that inspiring. We're now moving on to a speaker based in Nigeria who's been very active in the Open Government Partnership, but also in his own country. as a champion of beneficial ownership transparency. The Honourable Prince Clem Agba, Minister of State, Budget and National Planning. And Nigeria is, of course, one of the early partners to have signed up to the Open Extractives Programme. Over to you, Prince, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I bring you warm greetings from the President, the government, and the people of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. I also use this opportunity to convey the apologies and best wishes of the Honorable Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Zainab Ahmed. She sends her apologies and greetings from Cairo, where she's representing our country in another pre-confirmed meeting. I'm here not only as the Minister of State, but as the state actor co-chair of the Open Government Partnership. Let me once again convey to you Nigeria's full commitment to the Open Extractive Program and all that it represents. This program is timely, coming at the time President Buhari has just signed the Petroleum Industry Bill into law, and the implementation of the new law is about to commence. It is therefore a program that we intend to fully explore under the new law to advance and deepen the progress our country has already recorded in the implementation of beneficial ownership disclosures as part of the ongoing reforms in our extractive industries under the EITI framework and the Open Government Partnership. You will recall that at the London Anti-Corruption Summit in May 2016, President Muhammadu Buhari committed to a series of measures aimed at curbing corruption and blocking revenue leakages. In announcing Nigeria's intention to join the Open Government Partnership and reaffirming our obligation to the EITI process, President Buhari committed to establishing an open register of beneficial owners of companies operating in Nigeria. I note that our commitment as a country to EITI and the open extractive initiatives as key drivers of beneficial ownership disclosures are in view of the direct linkages to our government's strategic development challenges and priorities. That is, curbing corruption through blocking channels of illicit financial flows, tax evasion, and money laundering, and improving the livelihoods of citizens by building mechanisms through which government can be held accountable. It is for these reasons that Nigeria worked collaboratively with the civil society to launch its register of beneficial owners of companies in the extractive sector in December 2019 to meet the EITI requirement of member countries to develop such portals. The Corporate Affairs Commission, Nigeria's Companies Registry, in furtherance of our commitment to establish a public central register of beneficial owners of companies under the Open Government Partnership, is currently working to expand the register to cover all sectors. Last year, President Buhari signed the new Companies and Allied Matters Act into law. The new CAMA law provides a legal backing for the Corporate Affairs Commission to collect and publish information of beneficial owners of companies. The disclosure of beneficial owners of companies will have a direct impact on the award of government contracts and granting of licenses and permits, as well as support the work of anti-corruption, regulatory, and tax authorities. For instance, when the new register being developed by the Companies and Allied Commission is fully operational, the Bureau of Public Procurement will require all companies bidding for government contracts to have an up-to-date information of beneficial owners available on the CAC website. The register will also be linked to the Federal Inland Revenue Service database, as well as their banking information by the Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit. At the country level, several collaborative efforts are ongoing between the Corporate Affairs Commission and NAITI, as the former continues to review the existing register of beneficial owners of companies in the extractive sector to ensure that the central register meets global standards and is user-friendly. This process is without its challenges, while civil society partners are actively working with us on the development of the register. it remains a challenge to convey the organized private sector to elicit their requirement and expectation of the register, as they will be the primary source of data for and key users of the register. There is also the financial assistance needed to expand on the ongoing effort. CAC and AT are also contributing budgetary allocation to complement support received from the OGP Multi-Donor Trust Fund and other donors. More is still needed to fully build a register that meets global standards and contributes to the effort to drive transparency and accountability. The Open Extractive Program presents an opportunity for country peer learning, knowledge sharing, which will be very useful to broaden Haiti's ability to implement AITI principles and the objectives of the Open Extractive Programs and beneficial ownership disclosures in particular. In many resource-rich developing countries, the revenues derived from oil, gas, and all minerals can make a significant contribution to economic growth and development. Indeed, if managed well, the extractive sector can make the difference between prosperity and poverty for millions of people. But the extractive sector is also vulnerable to corruption. The EITI and its partners, therefore, have a vital role to play in improving the governance of the sector around the world. Let me also mention here that Nigeria is working towards becoming a member of the Beneficial Ownership Leadership Forum. I thank you all for your attention.
Minister, many thanks, and terrific to hear that commitment in your concluding remarks. We now have our final speaker, Sunuta Kaimal, who's President and Chief Executive Officer of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, a close partner of EITI and Open Ownerships in this endeavour. Sunita, over to you, please.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. We've all come together because we recognize that achieving beneficial ownership transparency is both urgent and essential in the global fight against corruption. Many of the speakers before me have emphasized the benefits to be reaped by countries in terms of advancing inequality, advancing sustainable development, and companies as well, cheaper and easier due diligence, a more level playing field. We have the opportunity to capitalize on this alignment of interests and incentives and the progress that has already been made towards a global beneficial ownership transparency norm by acting now with greater boldness and with greater ambition. I certainly echo the calls to action by the previous speakers on disclosure. Progress, while promising, has nonetheless been uneven and inefficient. And we don't want to be held captive by the transparency laggards, but instead seize momentum on this critical first step of beneficial ownership transparency. It's important that we are also targeting the range of companies involved, the license holders, commodity traders, and suppliers alike. Companies can help advance transparency in the near term rather than waiting for public registries or for other government actors. They can facilitate beneficial ownership transparency among their partners and the suppliers. Along with being champions, this is how companies actually drive progress on this mutually beneficial issue. Timely, accurate information in the public domain is, of course, the essential first step. But if our collective aim is to prevent corruption, we absolutely must go further. The time is now to really channel our energy, channel our resources towards using beneficial ownership information. We've heard from many of our speakers about those benefits, but we need to act to ensure that those benefits can actually come about. And let me talk a little bit about why and also how. Just last month, an international tribunal ruled that Isabel dos Santos, the daughter of the former Angolan president, must relinquish her stake in the Portuguese energy company Galp, which is estimated to be worth $500 million US. Ms. dos Santos and her husband had secured a stake for just $15 million in a deal that they made with Angola's national oil company back in 2006. The tribunal stated that the deal cannot be explained but for grand corruption by the daughter of a head of state and her husband. Gulp is only one of the many international companies that did business with Isabel dos Santos over the years. In the 2020 Luanda Leaks investigation, many of these relationships were revealed, and a number of firms have since cut their business ties. Dos Santos certainly used corporate secrecy to avoid scrutiny. Her empire included 400 corporate entities in 40 countries, including several secrecy jurisdictions. But here's the real challenge. Many, if not most, of her prominent partners knew perfectly well who they were working with. Her status as a beneficial owner was not secret. The problem was that these firms did not apply high enough standards when screening their business partners. They saw her bank accounts, saw her international credentials, ignored the red flags, and just signed on. This really speaks to the crux of the challenge when it comes to using beneficial ownership information to prevent corruption. We need to know who owns the company, absolutely, but governments and companies also need to very actively apply high ethical standards when evaluating that ownership information. And this is how beneficial ownership information can be used to prevent corruption. Look, I recognize that coming up with these standards is really not straightforward or easy. What constitutes a conflict of interest? What constitutes self-dealing? But we at NRGI have researched and analysis and engaged in dialogue with governments and companies and accountability actors to try to figure out the best way forward. On the side of producing country governments, we have reviewed 50 mining and oil laws and found that nearly half already prohibited certain officials from having beneficial ownership stakes in extractive projects, but none of them had processes in place to check whether or not there were violations of these prohibitions. Governments and state-owned enterprises who are allocating licenses or approving suppliers need strong standards for who can and who cannot participate in the sector, and systems for regularly screening whether applicants meet these standards. And we have seen the art of the possible. In the wake of the car wash scandal, Petrobras has made great strides in the way that it screens supplier companies. On the side of the companies, over the past 18 months, we at NRGI have been working with extractive companies, including many of those attending today's event, to wrestle with this very thorny question of how to respond when due diligence reveals political exposure. Our guidance is going to come out later this year, but we have a few recommendations that I just wanted to flag. First of all, companies should require beneficial ownership information from all third parties and publish that information for JV partners, major suppliers, and high-risk suppliers such as agents. Second, companies need to navigate the very tricky waters when beneficial ownership reporting reveals political exposure. We very much appreciate that companies can't just automatically eliminate the entity from consideration. Some political exposure poses no corruption risk at all, and cutting out risky politically exposed persons is hard in small countries or where political and business elites overlap. Therefore, what we recommend is that companies publish clear no-go areas upfront to reduce the number of discretionary decisions that they're making. These are the obvious restrictions that should apply across the board, such as entities that will not report their beneficial ownership information, or entities whose beneficial owners include an official with direct influence over the business in question. In addition, we recommend that companies apply what we call a harm-based screening. In other words, companies can ask, will partnering with this entity harm the country where we are working? Will it make corruption worse? This is a different question than asking about their own legal risks. Had companies undertaken such a review, they certainly would have ruled out partnering with Isabel dos Santos and avoided the scandals that followed. For those who are interested in these issues of conflict of interest and political exposure, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at NRGI, and we're more than happy to share further details. But I want to emphasize as a last point that as a complement to these actions by governments and companies, anti-corruption and beneficial ownership transparency supporters like the UK, like EITI, like Open Ownership, OGP, the B Team, and others can really play a critical role. we'd like to see more attention, more resources globally and in resource-rich countries devoted to this question of how beneficial ownership transparency should be used. Again, the progress that we've seen to date by EITI implementing countries and supporting companies is really encouraging. And our hope is that this momentum leads quickly and concretely to more information entering the public domain. However, the major opportunity is to use the beneficial ownership information and ensure that ramps up in lockstep with disclosure. Without that crucial complement, beneficial ownership information really risks being yet another inert data point. And we at NRGI stand ready to partner with civil society, with media, with companies, and with government to enable this meaningful action on beneficial ownership transparency and use of that information to combat and prevent corruption. Thank you so much.
Thank you too, Sunita, and for your very clear recommendations coming out of that work. We now have about 20 minutes or so for questions, both online and from in the room. I'm just going to turn to Joe to see if there's anyone who wants to come in now.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and thank you to our panelists. I want to ask if there's anyone online who wants to ask a question. Please raise your virtual hand, as I'm sure we're all used to doing by now. And please do come in with your questions. I'm not seeing anyone come in straight away. Maybe a little bit of a warming up is required. Is there anyone in the room who'd like to ask a question?
I'll hold. Okay. Good to see everybody. Building on Joe Powell from the Open Government Partnership, just picking up Sunita's point on the importance of disclosure, and a couple of you mentioned the, I think, John, you mentioned the Biden administration's intent to pick up at least collecting this information. One thing I would be interested in your thoughts on is whether there is a risk that with the US coming to below what the current emerging standard we'd like to see is, whether that will have an impact on other countries in terms of their willingness to disclose this information, and specifically maybe for Mark, whether there's an opportunity around the US coming back to an implementing status for EITI, where they would then at least be required in the extractive sector to go further than their legislation currently requires, because we're certainly picking up some mixed signals in terms of what message that might send to countries that don't yet have this legislation.
Let me pick up, Joe, the point addressed to me. We believe the administration is beginning to look at what it would mean to rejoin the EITI. We see that as a very positive indication of a commitment, of course, that was there in practice when the US was a member until 2017. But in fact, there is indeed, as you imply, a close connection between the willingness of the administration to rejoin and the passage of yet another conversation through the Securities and Exchange Commission on Dodd-Frank 1504, and that's going to start again in April. Now, one is very closely related to the other. If that comes through with a more aligned recommendation for project-level tax reporting for US companies in a US jurisdiction in particular, non-EITI jurisdictions, one that is aligned more closely with EU, UK, and Canadian legislation, then we can certainly see that will sow the seeds for the US rejoining EITI with support across all its constituencies, something that we're very hopeful will happen during the course of 2022 for exactly the reasons you've just set out.
The online team are very quiet at this point.
Well,
I was just wondering
please,
if someone
Tom,
wanted to
question.
pick up the first question around the US and pursuing a lower standard, for want of a better description. So anyone online want to pick that up? I'm kind of looking at Don potentially for a view from the United States as you're sat there.
Well, I certainly can't speak for the Biden administration, but I can tell you that there is progress being made. The Corporate Transparency Act was recently passed. which does put the onus on a registry being created. Now, the issue with that is the registry is not a public registry. It's a registry that would be controlled by FinCEN. It would be available to FinCEN, to other government regulators around the world. So that's at least progress that we're making. One of the challenges that I do believe the Biden administration may have is also getting the various U.S. states to comply. So you can have the national statutory requirements that come into place, but there are certain states within the U.S. that actually have restrictions right now on that type of disclosure for beneficial ownership. So there will also be a need for, I believe, the Biden administration to work with state governments, state governors, legislatures, and the like in those states. It's not widespread across all of the states in the U.S., but there are some. So I think those are some hurdles that are ahead. But as you said, I think, and as Mark said, I think certainly from a joining of EITI, this administration will be far more open to that than the previous administration. So I would expect and hope that we will see advancement in that. And then the CTA is a step forward, and hopefully we'll continue to advance that. And I think that's the role that we and others, as I said before, can play in this, is also having these conversations, both with our corporate clients, with our government clients, and with others in important positions to try to promote the benefit of doing so.
Don, can I just follow up with a further question around that, which is, it strikes me that one of the potentially huge benefits of the Biden administration's move to people in your industry is that if you could have a better view of what's going to be in that registry once it's created, it would make it far easier for you to do know your client due diligence. It would make it far quicker, far more certain, far less risky, far cheaper. And for quite a few of your clients too, the same would apply. So do you think there's going to be pressure from within the US corporate world for access to that once it's established?
I would like to think that that will be the case. I do believe that there's potential. I can assure you, and within our own organization, and because I run our forensic and financial crime organization within Deloitte, where we help our clients and also have many of these conversations with regulators, we are looking at the CTA. We've actively been assessing that, and we have many conversations, and many of my partners, in fact, are former regulators. So we look for opportunities to have those discussions and try to bring both our own government entities into the conversation as well as others. You know, one of the things that, and I mentioned this in my commentary, that I do believe needs to continue to happen is further and further advancement of discussions within regulators that control financial data. So FinCEN here in the UK, elsewhere around the world, to share more data and to share more perspectives. There's a lot greater conversation happening today across the globe than there was even 5 or 10 years ago. And so I think whether it's pressure from us, pressure from our corporate clients, pressure from government regulators outside of the U.S. to impress upon the U.S. regulatory agencies and the U.S. government of the importance that we'll continue to see an advancement in that regard.
Thank you very much. We have another question here in the front.
Thank you. Andrew Preston from the UK Government Home Office. Thank you to the panelists. I thought really interesting in terms of making the case and the need for beneficial ownership transparency, and a quite strong, we've obviously got the company commitments as well, and we've got some very clear articulation of what needs to happen. Can the panel say a little bit more about sort of follow-up and practical action that they envisage in the coming months to really progress this agenda? What do they think needs to be done to really take this agenda forwards?
I would look to the panel, I guess, potentially.
You first, Tom.
You. There's a lot. I think it's a continual focus on making sure we're communicating clearly about how we're going to get this done now. So we talk about the motivations, we talk about the incentives, we talk about the case for why, but I think for the businesses represented here today and anyone else listening, let's now get into asserting that we wish to see states take this step by a certain point, applying some clear pressure now that we, and forgive the kind of slightly English idiom, we're not going to dawdle on this anymore, right? We're going to actually move forward now and achieve what you have committed to. Now, I said earlier this morning, we've seen this huge growth of commitment since 2013. We go from the UK committing back then at Lochern, at the G8, all the way to 112 countries today. We still have a long way to go to make that real. So I think in terms of the next step from the private sector, it's sort of stepping up and going, this is what needs to happen, and we really need to see it by this kind of time. We are going to support you to do that. BHP Foundation putting in money to make that happen. But we need to make that a reality. And I think to pick up on Sunita's point, this can't be another inert data point, right? Let's set out what we need to see that proves it's not an inert data point. And I think business has a really powerful role to play to set some of the metrics of success around this. Otherwise, we run the risk of in a few years' time coming back and saying, look, there's still lots of commitment and there's still lots of enthusiasm, but we don't quite know how to judge if we've made it, and we haven't put the pressure on people to define what success looks like. So I think some of those areas are the things I'd love to see the private sector be a much more kind of robust on.
Just see if anyone else on the panel would like to come on back on that point.
Yeah, Mark, can I speak from here?
Of course, please do.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to say from Nigeria's point of view, we have also tried to practicalize this. So like you can see from 2016, when the president made the commitment in London, we have made steady progress around beneficial ownership register. Naiti, which is in the extractive industry, it's already has its register, and that is running, and reports have been done. For the larger Nigerian society, there was a need to amend the Companies and Allied Matters Act. That took quite a while. Various stakeholders were engaged, and eventually that was passed, and Mr. President has signed this. So what we are now doing is fiscally working on how to get that register operational. We are hopeful that by the end of the year, or latest the first quarter of the next year, we should get this larger register up and running. And like I said in my concluding statement, our next step is to work with the various stakeholders to see that Nigeria joins the Beneficial Ownership Leadership Forum. Thank you.
Mark, can I come in as well? This is Sunita.
Please do. Please do, Sunita.
Great, and thank you so much. So I really think it's important that we ensure that these efforts are resourced appropriately, and it's one of the reasons it's really exciting to see this initiative. John spoke earlier about beneficial ownership transparency being cheap. I think it's true because it leads to many more gains from both a business standpoint and from a country standpoint, but it's really important to resource anti-corruption programs effectively and fully. And I think that we've seen some of these programs fall short when that hasn't been the case, when there hasn't been that investment in the use of beneficial ownership registry information and otherwise enforcing anti-corruption rules. So as I mentioned, I think this is both the technical assistance and the training that needs to be provided to country authorities and to accountability actors, and really sparking that dialogue and discussion. But also, again, on the private sector side, and Don, I really appreciate your comments here, to gather together and to talk about what these higher standards look like. What do these strategies look like for advancing this work and ensuring that higher standards are adopted not only by companies, but also your clients in the work that you're doing. And then the last piece I really think is around civic space and just strengthening, protecting, involving civil society in anti-corruption efforts that will really be essential to the success of this beneficial ownership transparency drive, and to that translation from more information to greater accountability and ultimately to combating corruption. Thanks.
Can I just pick up on that last point? I think it's absolutely essential that this point about the civic society. One of the most powerful drivers of action for all of us is going to be boiling anger from middle classes who can see that their hard-earned savings have been swiped and moved offshore in every single country in the world where we have one of these registers. So if we can create that visibility, which will inevitably lead to that anger. It may be that people understand it's happening at the moment, but when they are confronted by it, it is visible, they can see where it's gone and who's got it. Then outrage will give wind in our sails, and it will make it impossible for this to be an inert data point, as Sunita rightly says, it's a danger. But so that is an incredibly powerful piece of energy. If we can just harness it, it will make the rest of what we have to do, all these very important detailed points that everyone's coming up with, it will make those things so much easier because people will not dare to stand in the way of public outrage broadly and widely felt.
Thank you very much. We have another question online.
Yeah, a very pertinent question has come in from Michael and Baron, and thank you for that question, Michael. Pertinent to Sunita's remarks there about the funding of resource governance initiatives. He says there are costs, although they're small in comparison to the cost of corruption, but there are costs involved in setting up beneficial ownership registers. And he asked, where can governments go to for funding, and how might they make the case for borrowing money for public beneficial ownership registers?
Well, I mean, we can help, and we do, and I think you know, the funding around this. I think look, I think I've experienced in my career, and many other people will probably feel the same, that, you know, very few people put a good idea down on the table, and when you do, funding will follow. So I think if there are jurisdictions out there who can demonstrate that there's commitment to do this, and if legislation is required, that there's a slot to do it, and the officials are in place, then funding will come. There are lots of sources out there around this, lots of institutions able to do it. So funding, I don't think funding for the work is per se problematic. I think making sure you can demonstrate that you will be able to deliver what you are promising with that money is, for many governments, going to be the bigger challenge. So that's my kind of sense on it.
Thank you.
I think this is also, if I could, Mark, I think this is also about messaging. And I think one of the things that we have to be focused on is continuing to send the message of the value that beneficial ownership brings, the value that trust brings. Fear is something that, yes, it can get action. And I think the point that Ms. Penrose, you made just a moment ago is very, very pertinent. But fear doesn't last. The fear and the impact of fear isn't a lasting effect. If you can change the mind, the heart, and the soul of our leaders, both corporate and government, and you can truly help a government see the value, the cost is so small relative to the return on that investment by virtue of the value that would be generated for the government directly, whether it be through tax revenues, increased economic stability and capabilities, as well as just the trust perspective and the trust that would bring with their populace. The ROI is huge. And I think if we continue to press this and push this argument, both from the professional services sector and the corporate sector and working with the government, that has far lasting value in a greater capacity than fear or otherwise.
Thank you, Don. That's helpful. Now, we're drawing to the close of this session. And John, I want to turn to you again, if I might. We're in London, and that's not by accident. We're in London because many of the companies who've been part of the conversations we've been having today and making public commitments around beneficial ownership transparency have their headquarters here. But today is also chosen very deliberately. It's on the eve of the G7 Interior Ministers track meeting here in London, and we want to send clear messages about the importance of this agenda that the UK in its presidency has already identified. So, John, what would be your advice on the messages that we need to give to the G7 ministers, and what is the UK going to do to amplify the commitments already made during its G7 presidency?
I think the messages are very, very simple. I mean, the first point to make is that the UK, feels this is tremendously important, just as one country amongst many, but as you say, president of the G7 this year. So we believe this is incredibly important. We've believed it for a long time, and we are not about to take our foot off the accelerator now either. You saw some announcements earlier on in the G7 year, a month or so back, in this space already. So I don't think there's, I think it was right to say, I think it was Don was saying that political commitment is one of the most important things, apart from the costs of writing the code to create one of these registers. Political commitment is the thing that really makes the difference one way or another. Be in no doubt the UK cares about this and wants to be part of it and wants to take a leading role. Can we please make sure that as many other leading countries and as many other leading companies get on the bus, join the movement, get involved? It pays off, and we can all do well by doing good.
Thank you so much for that rousing conclusion. So let me conclude by just making 3 points. We spoke about John and I being on a panel in Ottawa 2.5 years ago. I would suggest a lot has changed and progressed since then. There's a long way to go, but what's so significant about today's conversation is strong private sector leadership. Now, very much in the extractive sector that we've heard about, but it will go more widely. And we look very much towards other companies as members of EITI to sign up and join the 6 companies that have already put their names to the company statement. We look forward to that happening in the coming weeks and months. And we've heard some really important commitments from the professional services companies represented here today as well. We're also looking to the Open Government Partnership, which has already more commitments on beneficial ownership transparency, to translate those into actionable follow-on through national action plans as we go forward with this important agenda. So there's plenty of momentum and forward-looking actions that we hope will result from today's events. And let me thank you, John, and the other panelists for all your contributions today to a very successful event, and to BHP for its leadership and for hosting today's discussion. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you.